Okay, great. So preparing for a community assistance visit. So there's a quick poll question, and I would like you guys in the chat box to type in some observations that you have. How many of you have been part of a community assistance visit process? Okay, so we'll ask the next question. Now, whether you've had a community assistance visit or not, people like to talk. So we would like to know if you think the process is as bad as rumors say, or if there have been rumors or things that you've heard. Type those in the chat box, and we would love to know what you've heard, what you think you know about this process, so that we can kind of talk through some of those issues while we go through the presentation today. Okay, so I will look at some of those comments a little bit later, but we'll continue on. Community assistance visit goals. Whenever we come to a community, whether it's myself, whether it's Tammy, or both of us, there's certain goals we would like to see accomplished during these visits. The first is to provide technical assistance. One of the benefits of doing a community assistance visit is having one-on-one time with the state coordinator or with FEMA to discuss floodplain management for your local community. This is an opportunity where we sit down and have an agenda and talk about various floodplain management topics. We discuss any and all floodplain management questions you may have regarding your ordinance, regarding administration and enforcement. So it's a really great one-on-one visit where you can ask questions, and when there's some deficiencies identified, we sit down and talk about how to remedy them and how to work with the local community. Or let's say that you have multiple disciplines that work in floodplain management, but maybe don't have a good working relationship with one another, talking about bringing staff together and trying to have better lines of communication, and seeing where maybe there's holes in a process that need to be filled, and just working on things. So I think that's probably one of the best benefits of having the meeting, is just talking about technical assistance and just having a one-on-one visit. The second thing is to identify potential violations. So as we go through a community assistance visit, we do have an agenda. We talk about permitting, we talk about site plans, we talk about elevation certificates, floodway encroachments, permitting for public utilities, variances. So we go through the whole gamut of floodplain management topics, and we talk about the strengths and the weaknesses of a local community, and identify maybe some potential violations if a community isn't necessarily doing anything in their flood damage prevention, resolution, or ordinance. And then once the meeting is done, sometimes we have a follow-up meeting or a CAV closure meeting to sit down and talk with the community about violations that have been identified. Before the pandemic, Tammy Hansen and I were with Metro Nashville, and we had a meeting with Tom Palco, Roger Lindsay, and the entire staff to talk about some of the issues or deficiencies that we saw with their program. One thing that you guys maybe don't think about enough is that if you have building code regulations and you have floodplain management regulations or you have stormwater regulations, is everything in harmony? Is everything cohesive? Is everything together? Are there anything within your other regulations that maybe negate or conflict with your local floodplain management regulations? So it's really a good time for us to look at your regulations and see if everything is in harmony and if everything is together. And then we just sit down and kind of talk about those issues kind of an after meeting. And then our main goal is to really strengthen a community's ability to reduce flooding, and then to provide guidance in educating elected officials and the community. One thing, we send the community assistance visit letter to the mayor. Sometimes we have them come to the meeting. Most of the time they do not. So even though they get a letter making them aware of the date and time and some of the issues that we're going to be speaking to the floodplain administrator about, sometimes they're there, sometimes they're not. When they do attend the meetings, it's good to talk about floodplain management and talk about, as a participating community, some of the responsibilities that a community is tasked with. Because a lot of times when you have mayors, they're in office, let's say one term, maybe 2 terms, and they switch to another, or they could be in the office for a really long time and maybe haven't looked at the regulations in a while. So it's a good refresher for them to understand the importance of this program and the technical assistance that the state and FEMA provides, as well as public assistance, individual assistance, hazard mitigation grants, and how all of that works together to make a complete floodplain management program that's strong. So the one thing that's really beneficial about doing a community assistance visit is to take the time to understand flood issues and community characteristics. With 400 communities in the state of Tennessee, no 2 communities are the same. Everybody has different strengths, weaknesses, opportunities to grow and to be better with floodplain management. No community has a perfect program. So even if you feel overwhelmed or understaffed, you're not the only one. So our goal is to try to have these meetings to talk with the communities, give them a sense of confidence, to try to increase the comfortability and awareness of programs, and then to equip you with tools necessary to manage your program and to manage a floodplain inside and outside the special flood hazard area. So, you know, sometimes when I go to communities, I talk about building codes establishment, sometimes talk about property maintenance, subdivision regulations, zoning, and just trying to get education for the floodplain administrator, talking about L273, the basics of floodplain management. It's really a time just to kind of understand some of the struggles that the local community has with floodplain management. We also can give technical assistance and provide information for the Army Corps of Engineers to maybe do a floodplain management study, and just talk about some of the different resources that are available to communities and hazard mitigation grants, and just trying to piece together the puzzle of different opportunities for communities when they struggle with various items for floodplain management. So the logistics, so normally myself or Joseph or Tammy will reach out to a community that we identify on a list. FEMA populates a list of communities and when they should get a community assistance visit. And then we also try to assess the community's knowledge and understanding of the NFIP requirements. So once we call a community and say, hey, we're going to be having a community assistance visit, we schedule a date and time. And then we also send them information ahead of time to discuss certain information that we need, whether it be floodplain permits, the regulations, and then we assist in implementing effective floodplain measures when violations or program deficiencies are identified. Sometimes when we've had community assistance visits, I will sit down and look at the permit files and the elevation certificates. And then as a courtesy for the local community and for the local surveyors, I'll sit down and write a mini novel, write out every single error that's on an elevation certificate, or to write out every single issue or deficiency that needs to be fixed. So once you do have the meeting, the community is not necessarily left by themselves to try to figure out what's wrong. We do send a detailed letter, whether it's state or FEMA, identifying deficiencies and violations, and a time frame and some recommendations to address those. So when we come to a meeting with the local floodplain administrator and staff, if they have staff, or the elected official, there's certain items that we want to review when we sit down at the table. So one of the first things that we want to see is your local floodplain management ordinance. This is one that seems to be a struggle for a lot of communities, is that they don't necessarily know where their floodplain ordinance is located, or they give us a copy that is unsigned and not dated. So when we are coming for a community assistance visit, this is one of the first things that we want to look at to determine if the community has adopted the recent statewide model ordinance and what the standards are. Does the community have higher regulatory standards? Are they just have the state standards, or do they have an ordinance that's outdated and needs to be updated? So that's the first thing, that when we come in to visit a community, we want to have a copy of your ordinance to review and to also have on the file. So for some folks, I'm actually going to be doing a community assistant visit tomorrow. So this will be one of the first things that I ask the community that I'm meeting with, may I have a copy of your ordinance? So that's the first thing, is to make sure that when we're coming to visit, that your files are in order, that your paperwork is in order. Because the more organized you are, the more efficient the meeting will be. And the next item that we want to see are your flood insurance rate maps. Do you have paper copies of your flood insurance rate maps? Do you have the Z-fold maps available for the public to look at if they come in? Not everybody is internet savvy. Not everybody has the internet, and some of the stakeholders and citizens maybe don't know how to look it up, but having a paper copy, some folks prefer that method. And so every single community, when they enter the National Flood Insurance Program, have paper copies of their maps. Now, if you can't locate them before we're coming, or even after this call, if we don't have a visit scheduled with you before June 30th, you may just want to go back and look at your record keeping. Do you have a copy of your ordinance? Is it signed? Do you have a copy of your flood insurance rate maps available? And are they all together? The next is permit files. I've been in this position, next month it'll be 7 years, so I have lots of stories about permit files. And the biggest thing is to be organized. Is that whether I'm coming, or Tammy's coming, or Trish is coming in the future to do a community assistance visit, what do your floodplain permit files look like? There's some folks that have digital files where they have everything online and they just type in and click, do a few clicks and scroll down and you can see everything. And then there's some folks that have paper permit files. So if you do have a paper permit file, are you able to separate within the last 5 years all the floodplain development permits? One time I went to a community in West Tennessee, or I actually did a community assistance contact call. And the lady said that she had 400 permits, but she didn't have them separated, and it wouldn't take her that long to separate them. That's a fallacy. So you want to make sure that if you have floodplain development permits and you have paper files, that your file folders are maybe in a different color, or you keep them in a different file cabinet drawer, but that you're able to access them if we were coming in to do a visit. Is really important. The next thing, talking about a permit application, is how do you actually keep the paperwork within the file? Years ago, I did a community assistance visit, and the staff secretary was supposed to have all the files organized. And when I got there and started looking at them, no two files were the same. So you may want to think about how you keep them organized. We're not going to tell you what method you should do, but if you have, let's say, the the permit application in the front, you have the site plan. After that, you have the finished construction elevation certificate. Have some sort of order where you're going to have forms in the file so that whether I'm looking at them or if, let's say, a citizen is asking for their finished construction elevation certificate, so you have them in the folder in a manner that anybody could find it if you were on vacation or if you were out sick, that it makes sense and that it's reasonable and that there's a uniformity to it is really important. The other thing is to have elevation certificates in the file and to make sure that they're complete. You want to make sure as a community official you do not write on an elevation certificate or you invalidate it. If you're looking at section G where it's for the community permit files, you're going to want to make a copy of that and then have it as an attachment in the back to the elevation certificate. If you put the permit number, if you put the date the certificate of occupancy was issued, but again, you don't necessarily want to write on them because it does invalidate. And you want to make sure that those are in order, that you have the correct permit file. Let's say you have 435 Grant Street, that you have the elevation certificate for 435 in the file and not, let's say, 440. So you want to make sure that your file system is accurate and correct. And then also if you have issues where there's non-compliance, that you document those and have those as part of your permit file is really important. And the next item, no-rise analysis documentation. If you are working with someone that's doing development along a stream, whether it's unmapped, Zone A, Zone AE without a floodway, or Zone A with a floodway, that there's an engineering analysis that's documented with that. And again, you want to probably, because some of the HEC-RAS models are digital, you may just want to have a file on your computer with the PDFs and different information in there. But again, you want to have documentation if someone, whether it's public works, whether it's a private citizen, or whether it's a business, you have that information on file. You also want to have information if a variance has been issued or if someone has applied for a variance. What is always surprising to me is if you're a floodplain administrator, if someone writes a request for a variance, the floodplain administrator should have staff comments regarding whether it falls under those categories or if it's invalid. So, you know, an economic hardship is not a hardship because it's just someone that maybe doesn't want to pay the money to do what they're supposed to do. So again, as a staff person, as a floodplain administrator, you want to make sure that you have a staff report with that, and that you also have those variances in a file so that when we come and we look over the last 5 years of your permitting and your record keeping, that you have that information available. And then if a variance was granted, you also are supposed to have documentation in the file on that. But as we've talked about many times before, if it's in the gray, no way. So you're better off not to issue a variance because it can come back to haunt you. Tammy gave the illustration, I believe last year, maybe a year and a half ago, of Houston, Texas, where they granted a variance for someone that didn't want to elevate their home. Their home got flooded, so she sued the city and won. So again, you want to be very careful about variances. Written administrative procedures, if you have any, you want to have those available for the meeting. And then the other thing is to know about flood insurance policies, premiums, and structures. If you are a mayor, I know I've seen a couple mayors on the calls today. One of the questions that I always ask and I don't get a good answer is how many community-owned or governmental buildings are in the floodplain? Most local communities don't have that information, or if they have a city administrator, there should be flood insurance policies on those structures. We have had a few communities where the city administrator decided to stop paying the premium on a flood insurance policy, canceling that, and then putting the money aside in case there's ever damage. And while that sounds like a good idea, maybe they keep that money for a year or two and then they decide to use that money for something else. If there is a flood event, that can be dangerous because most communities, if it's a non-residential building and it gets flooded, are they going to have the money to fix the structure, and are they going to have money to purchase contents in that building? Another issue to think about, if you are a local community, if you have records in the basement or the lowest level of the structure, you may want to think about moving them to a higher floor, or digitizing them and having them as part of the cloud in case there's a flood event and those records get damaged. That's really hard to try to recover for a community. So that's one thing that we talk about when we have a community assistance visit. So as I talked about earlier, it is a comprehensive assessment of the community floodplain management program. We talk about everything under the sun. It's normally an hour and a half to 2 hour meeting. We look at your permit application, we look at your files, and really we talk about how the community is implementing the ordinance. And if there's struggles or if there's confusion or if there's questions, the meeting is really to assist the community and enhance and strengthen the capability, the comfortability, and making sure that you're implementing all of the various requirements of the ordinance, and then talking about resolving any issues or problems. And then as part of the community assistance visit, whether it's the state, FEMA, or both, we document deficiencies and then recommend enforcement action. So we have right now 23 open CAVs in the state where there's various deficiencies. So we've started sending letters to the communities to address some of those deficiencies. We have some where it's just a simple deficiency where the homeowner did not necessarily has a crawl space foundation, didn't put in foundation open enforcement standpoint to try to get the homeowner to do that. But then when it comes to real life, sometimes the homeowners don't want to do that. But if they don't do it, they're going to be paying much more for flood insurance. So again, kind of making sure that when you have building inspectors going out and looking at a foundation type and it's in the floodplain and it is a crawl space, making sure that those foundation openings are there, making sure that the floodplain administrator and the building inspector are talking, and then there's a good line of communication. Because oftentimes the community will just accept an elevation certificate and never look at it. And that really harms the strength of your program, and it also harms citizens, because if they don't do what they're supposed to do and they don't follow the regulations, they could be paying an exorbitant rate for flood insurance because maybe the over-the-counter consultation wasn't there or wasn't clear, or they just went ahead and built it and forgot about it, and the building inspector didn't issue a stop work order to get that corrected. So again, it's just making sure that all the I's are dotted, T's are crossed, to make sure that you catch things before they become much larger, much harder to try to remedy. It makes it difficult. So some of the key components of a community assistance visit is really to study floodplain issues pertaining to the community's participation. When a community participates in the National Flood Insurance Program, they pass a resolution of intent. They complete an application stating how many structures in the floodplain, how much acreage, and then they also adopt flood damage prevention resolution. So this is an opportunity to kind of talk about a community's participation in the program and what's required, and really talk about what they're doing well, what they need help on, and what are deficiencies and violations. And so after we look at all the paperwork and the documentation and have the meetings with the floodplain administrator and other staff that's involved with floodplain management, one of the things that I do and Tammy does as well is to conduct floodplain tours of the area on the flood insurance rate map. So a lot of times when you guys are making permits of areas for folks that are developing in the community, we're actually out there driving to see if there's other development occurring in the floodplain that maybe hasn't received a permit, or if we see a structure that's built in the floodplain, is there a finished construction elevation certificate? So one of the times I was in a community and did a community assistance visit with the floodplain administrator, and unfortunately they don't have any enforcement capabilities. The county has decided they don't want to do anything, but there was one surveyor that will submit elevation certificates. So that the county assessor and I drove the whole floodplain. He was with me the whole week, took the whole week off to go with me. And so we would stop every so often. We would go down the road and he'd say, "Stop, Amy," and I'd back up and he'd write down the house number to start assessing property. So again, if you are a floodplain administrator, it's good to go out and see what type of development is happening in the floodplain. I received a call yesterday from a community A neighbor was upset because her neighbor put fill on his property and built a garage, and she didn't believe that he had a permit for that. So I told her to call the local community. So again, if you're not necessarily going out and looking at your floodplain because of COVID, there's a lot of citizens that are home right now that are watching other folks. So you may get phone calls about potential violations. So you do want to make sure that you go out and tour the floodplain every so often. So we do meet with community officials. And then one of the things that people kind of giggle about is when we do go to a community, we sit down and review all the permit applications and permits. So that's one of the things that we do. So we will ask before we come to a community, when we send a letter of information that's going to be reviewed, one of the things is to review permit applications and the files. So if the files are helter-skelter, we will sit there and look through them and make notes. We will look at your floodplain ordinance and document anything that is a deficiency and talk about substantial damage. If you have a process and a system in place, Trish last month did a training on substantial damage estimator software and how to do substantial damage. And for my floodplain administrators on the call today, FEMA will no longer come out and do substantial damage determinations for a community. That's a local community's responsibility. So if you've never ever sat down and looked at that substantial damage estimator software, please do so, because it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. There's going to be a disaster coming to your community. And the worst time in the world to try to figure out how to use it is after a disaster. So you do want to make sure that you look at it, that you talk to your emergency management professionals so that they are aware of it, so that you have a team effort. Now, some communities may not only have a staff of 3 or 4, and they're not going to have maybe a team effort on it. But again, you just want to be aware of what you're responsible in doing. And then the adequacy of flood insurance rate maps. We have had a program in the past where there's communities that, let's say you're Giles County, and in the unincorporated areas, you have all of Zone A. They have requested from FEMA to have some remapping done. So they're going to be getting some base level engineering done this year. We have a meeting next month. So it is an opportunity to sit down and talk about your flood insurance rate maps, or if you're rapidly growing and there are certain watersheds or streams that you want to have restudied, that's an opportunity to do it as well. And then we assess your record keeping and tell you what's good and what's not. Sometimes on done community assistance visits, the records aren't really ready. So I will sit for a day, sometimes a day and a half, and go through records and ask for things, or ask for a list of all the permits that have been done in the last 5 years, and then look at the map service center to determine what permits were done in the special flood hazard area. And then we have actually sent a letter to a community to kind of go through and request more information. So if your records aren't clear, it's not going to be clear for us. So you want to make sure that you have all of that. I can't stress it enough, to be organized and to be clear on what you're doing. Now, if you're not, and a lot of you guys know whether or not you do a good job or not. That's, you guys know that. I don't need to tell you. So if you're not doing a good job on your record keeping, or if you haven't looked at it in a while, now is the time to start looking at it and maybe improve. And then we also discuss community concerns and different issues that a community struggles with. And then we submit a comprehensive summary of findings report to the local community as a CAV follow-up letter. And then we submit it with the time frame to resolve certain issues and reporting results. Sometimes we've had meetings with folks where, let's say, for instance, they don't have any elevation certificates over the last 5 years. We recently had a call with a couple communities and gave them a time frame to give us all the permits for the last 5 years to try to determine how many elevation certificates are needed for compliance. So again, if you have building code officials, you want to make sure that you talk to them, that they understand some of the various program regulation requirements, and then just making sure that you're organized. I can't stress that enough. It's just super important. So when we look at the ordinances I talked about earlier, the first thing we're going to do is verify compliance. So the first thing that we're going to do is look to see the date that it was adopted. Has it been adopted after the 2009 model? Is it current? And then also, does it have the map panels and effective dates? Sometimes people take editorial liberties and they go into the flood insurance rate map panel section and they edit it and they only put the last 3 numbers for their flood insurance rate maps instead of having the entire number and the suffix on the end. So we look at that to see if it's compliant. And then if there's also been a remapping study, we've had a lot of communities become effective recently, so we've had to go through and revise and reissue model ordinances for communities to adopt. We had quite a few that took editorial liberties that made me want to pull my hair out. So if we send it to you, there's only 3 things that you need to edit for a local community. So when we have additional remapping studies that are going to be coming effective later on this year, that we're going to have more community outreach so that we have less sections that are removed or where they just rewrite it entirely that's not compliant with the Code of Federal Regulation. So we also make sure that with the floodplain management ordinance, every single community has a designated floodplain administrator. So as I've laughed many times before, sometimes when I call communities, I say, can I talk to your floodplain administrator? A lot of times I hear we don't have one. Well, that's not the right answer. If you're a participating community, every single community has a designated floodplain administrator. So in every single participating community's ordinance, it has written in there who the floodplain administrator is. So whenever we go and have these meetings, that's one of the first things we look at, because if it's the mayor that's designated as a floodplain administrator, but the building inspector is the one that's actually the floodplain administrator, that needs to be revised so that it's current and it actually has the right person designated as a floodplain administrator. And then we also look to see the date the ordinance has been adopted. So again, you want to make sure that when we're coming for a visit, or even in your floodplain management file, that you have a signed, dated copy in your files. Because if we don't have that, we will ask for it. And if we have to write it in the follow-up letter to request it, we will. But we actually want to have that documentation. So if there ever is a question, I recently did a community assistance visit with a community in East Tennessee, and had a developer that had questions about the regulations. And so I was able to just pull up what they had given me, was able to cite certain sections that he had questions on. So again, we're also asking this so that within the FEMA community information system that we can upload that ordinance in there, so that there's a current copy online if anyone ever has any questions, or if there's a potential violation, to see what the community has adopted and what their standards are. So it is important, again, to have a signed and dated copy in the file. The flood insurance.
Amy, can I jump in real quick?
Make sure that it's accurate. And then, as we talked about, if there's areas of restudy, the floodplain administrator or the mayor can say, hey, we want to have, let's say, Killbuck Creek restudy at the southern end of the county. So you want to make sure that if there's areas of restudy or if there's areas of concern that you have flooding issues, that you let us know during this meeting or after the meeting, so that we can put it on the list. Because sometimes after a hurricane and FEMA restudies, let's say Florida, but they have a little bit of money left over, sometimes we can use some of that money to do a smaller physical map revision in Tennessee or other states. And then what does the community use to determine flood zones? So some folks use flood insurance rate maps. Some folks use the FEMA Map Service Center website. Some communities use the Tennessee Property Viewer. So what are you using to determine flood zones? Now, on the flip side, whenever you're getting a development proposal, what is the surveyor using to determine where the special flood hazard area is located? So last week I got a site plan for a community where someone was building a flood wall and building a garage, but the flood insurance or the site plan didn't have any flood insurance rate map information on there. It didn't have any of the floodplain drawn on the site. So I have to call the surveyor and ask for that information. So again, when you're doing over-the-counter consultation, it's important to talk to the surveyors to make sure that they download the National Flood Hazard Layer from the FEMA Map Service Center website on the site plan, so that you have assurance that it's done correctly. And so one of my favorite surveyors who's on the call today, Mr. Aaron Sam, was talking about how that they can take the national flood hazard layer and they can geo-reference it on their site plan to make sure that it's done correctly. So again, you just want to have a good working relationship with your surveyors to make sure that they adequately and accurately represent the special flood hazard area for a site. And again, so for the permit files, when we think about the term development for the National Flood Insurance Program, we're talking about any kind of man-made change to improved or unimproved real estate, but not limited to mining, grading, paving, storage of machinery, equipment, any kind of residential structure, a bridge, a culvert, a fence, fill, excavating. So you want to make sure that whenever you're talking to someone, the first question that you want to ask them is, what are you proposing to do to the site? And whether they're doing an addition or a remodel, you want to have all that information, because a lot of times people will call me and say, hi, I don't know if I'm talking to the right person. I don't know if I'm at the right office. And the same sort of thing happens to local communities when someone comes in and they're wanting to develop. They don't necessarily know what they're supposed to be asking, and they're not quite sure what they're supposed to be doing. And that's where we really struggle statewide, is that the over-the-counter consultation is not as good as what it should be. And part of it is that floodplain administrators maybe don't have development happening frequently. So every time it's, you know, having to learn Greek all over again. And then there's others that maybe just don't take the time to learn it as they should. So again, you want to make sure that whether you're the permit person or if you have other staff that are issuing permits, that you have a permit application that has all the different types of development listed on the form, so that you can go through and say, okay, are you putting fill on the site? Are you building a structure? Are you putting pavement? What are you doing at the site? So that you have a good understanding, because a lot of times when people are coming in to do development, they're not sure what's required of them, and they get a little flustered and they get a little overwhelmed. But you want to make sure that you kind of reassure them and just kind of take those baby steps to ask them exactly what they're doing. The other important thing with a permit is looking at the special flood hazard area, the national flood hazard area. And when you're looking on a GIS map, that you make sure that you look to see. I had a realtor probably 2 weeks ago that was looking at a piece of property, and he went on the FEMA Map Service Center website and it just dropped a pin. But when you actually look at the Tennessee property viewer, the whole entire lot, 90% of it was in the floodway. So again, even if you drop a pin, you still want to look at your flood insurance rate maps or the Tennessee property viewer and click on the show FEMA DFIRM layer to make sure that you're really looking at it correctly, because just because the FEMA Map Service website drops that pin does not mean that's exactly where the proposed development is going to be. And again, you always want to CYA and not make assumptions, because if you break that word down, you get in trouble. So you want to make sure you do your due diligence at the beginning to make sure that you don't have any kind of issue or any kind of problem. So again, all development in the floodplain in the special flood hazard area has to have a permit on file. And then final elevation certificates should be provided for all new construction and substantial improvements. And as I've said a million times, it has to be done by a licensed Tennessee surveyor. So again, you want to make sure that you have that on file and that you review them. And if they're not compliant, if you're not sure whether or not they're compliant, you can always send it to me and have me review it. I don't mind doing that. But you want to make sure that they are compliant, because unfortunately there has been horror stories where folks have done the wrong building diagram and switched elevation numbers on the elevation certificate. And I had a friend paying $9,000 for flood insurance because the crawl space foundation the surveyor put as a basement. So again, you want to be looking at it. Recently had an elevation certificate where the surveyor put that it was a diagram 6 with an enclosure. So imagine a house up on stilts with an enclosure, but it was actually crawl space. So I know a lot of you guys say, well, the surveyor is going to submit it, the surveyor's licensed and the surveyor's competent, so whatever he or she submits is right. So you can't have that necessary assumption. You've actually got to sit down and look at it. So you want to make sure that you do that. So just don't go lickety split. And just because somebody wants something today doesn't mean you can't say, hey, I'm going to look at it and try to tell you tomorrow. So you are allowed to ask for a little bit of time to review these. You should be able to give your building inspector time to go out and inspect the site But again, you just want to do a thorough job when you're doing permitting and inspection. So again, documentation of a variance and compliance with the criteria and conditions for granting a variance. If someone is asking for a variance, they should be having documentation, and then there should be a letter to the applicant notifying them of increased flood risk, hazards, and increased cost of flood insurance. Because if they do get a variance that's granted, they do get a surcharge on their flood insurance policy. You do have to write a letter for that and keep that in the file, so that is important. But again, as we talked about earlier, we want to make sure that we don't do that so often because that can be a problem. So record review is typically 5 years. Whenever a community assistance visit is scheduled for your community, you're going to go back in time 5 years and get those permits that have been issued. So one thing that we ask, and especially the last 2 years has been kind of a problem. When I sit down and I ask the floodplain administrator how many permits have been issued in the special flood hazard area, I never get a straight answer. When I come in, I want to know. And when we give you the letter, you've got to look at it and you've got to have everything together. If you need additional time and say, hey, Amy, we're not going to make this 6-week window until the meeting. We need 8 weeks. We need 10 weeks. It's okay to say that, but whenever I come in or FEMA comes in, it makes life a whole lot easier if you're prepared just to let us know how many permits have been issued. Typically, most communities haven't had a variance granted, but if you do, having the paperwork is important so that we can look at that. And then we also talk about discussion of development patterns. A lot of communities have been built out and maybe they're having a redevelopment of floodplain areas, or there's areas left in the community and it's just a floodway that's being developed. So again, we sit down and talk about development patterns and what has been going on in the last 5 years and what's happening now and possibly in the future. We also discuss issues with flooding within the community. There are some times where there's a lot of development that's occurring, and so sometimes it could be a stormwater issue. It could be maybe, let's say Sam Huddleston and I are neighbors, and Sam rakes his leaves and puts it in the ditch and it dams it up and it floods my front yard. Sometimes there can be issues where neighbors aren't necessarily raking up their leaves, or they put bags of trash or something that causes dam, or there's debris issues. That's one question that we talk about a lot, is who's in charge of removing that debris. There's some communities that have public works that will go out and go to the storm or drainage basins and clear out some of that debris. In other communities, it's up to the local citizens to do that. Exactly what is your policy? Because sometimes I get those calls from folks around the state, and it'd just be good that when I come in to visit, that you're able to tell me what the community standard is. And then also, as we talked about areas of restudy, if there's certain areas that you're having flooding concerns, we talked about that as well. Repetitive loss data. Whenever we come for the community assistance visit, FEMA has a community information system where we can kind of give general information about the number of flood insurance policies, how many policies are pre-firm before a community entered the National Flood Insurance Program versus post-firm, how many structures have been built after the community started participating in the National Flood Insurance Program. We talk about the different types of structures that have flood insurance, whether it's residential, multifamily, non-residential, what zone it's in. And then we also give general information about repetitive loss properties. So repetitive loss properties are 2 or more flood insurance claims totaling $1,000 or more in a consecutive 10-year period. So we give that information to the floodplain administrator, and a lot of times the floodplain administrator will give that to the emergency manager for the county if they're working on a hazard mitigation plan, or if they're thinking about applying for a hazard mitigation grant. Now, it's not going to give you property-specific information due to privacy laws, but it can tell you how many properties have had a repetitive loss or a severe repetitive loss. And FEMA has a new system, the ISAA agreement, where a community has to do an intergovernmental agreement with FEMA to request for repetitive loss or severe repetitive loss information. So I know, like a lot of you before would contact Doug Warden or Carrie Cochran over at the State Hazard Mitigation Office to get that. That is no longer an option. You have to have an agreement with FEMA. And once you get that information, you cannot share that with other folks. So if you have that and you're doing a hazard mitigation plan, you can just write in a general statement about where you have issues, but you can't say, oh, we have 5 properties on Clark Street that are rep losses. You can't do that, but you can say there's certain areas in the county or the city that have rep loss areas. So talk about general documentation, talk about the number of building permits issued in the special flood hazard area, number of variances, number of insurance policies. Sometimes we talk about population growth in a community if you're rapidly developing and how that is affecting floodplain management. And let's say you're planning and zoning office or your building codes department. Another issue that has been interesting is annexation and boundary changes. Some of you guys, the communities that you reside in, you've had a lot of annexations, you've had different boundary changes, but the flood insurance rate maps do not reflect that. If there's ever a disaster, if there's ever a flood event and you're looking to get public assistance, if you don't have proper corp limits, and if the corp limits go in between 2 counties and FEMA doesn't have record of that, you're not going to get money for the area that's not on your current flood insurance rate maps. So that has become an issue when we've had different disasters in the last couple of years. And then some communities have one that doesn't want to go back in time and get all the annexation resolutions and a GIS map to delineate where the new boundary is. So if you do have annexations and boundary changes, we do want to know that during the community assistance visit. Letter of map changes. I wish I could do a poll, but how many of you guys have signed up through FEMA to get your once a month notification of letter of map changes? I sent out an email last year that you can actually sign up for a subscription to have your letter of map changes sent to you. So if you have that subscription, great. But as a floodplain administrator, you should have all your letter of map changes in a file, whether it's designated by address or parcel number or whatever. So let's say, for instance, that I got a letter of map amendment and I'm selling my home, but I can't find that paperwork. I may not know how to look it up, but I may call your office to ask for a copy of that. So if you haven't looked at your letter of map changes recently, you're going to want to look at your FEMA Map Service Center website. You can search all products, put state of Tennessee, the county that you're in, the community name, and then you hit search, and then under effective products, you can hit letter LOMC for letter of map changes, and you can download all those PDFs and save them in a file. Because if you go on vacation or if someone calls and you just need a quick reference, it's good to have all that identified and organized in a file so that you just know where some of the letter of map changes are. Keep in mind that just because if somebody does a letter of map revision based upon fill, and if it's for the structure, you also want to look on that form for additional considerations, because sometimes it'll say that portions remain in the floodplain or portions remain in the floodway. So sometimes people will come in and say, well, hey, I got this, it's for the whole thing, but they don't look at that additional consideration column to see if there's portions that remain. If you have that issue, you're going to want to reach out to the FEMA Map Information Exchange, and you're going to have to request the case file for that letter of map change to see what remains. Because unfortunately, it's not something that you can look up online and you can see a site plan. And it's not even something that I have on file either. But it is good if you have that to reach out and request that. It does take several weeks to get it, so it's not going to be a fast process. And we also have a general discussion of the number of repetitive loss properties. If there's a certain neighborhood that has it, you can consider doing hazard mitigation grants. We do talk about that, and we do talk about whether it's HMGP, FMA, or BRIC grants. for a community, and then try to just get you connected with Doug Warden and Carrie Cochran if there's a project you want to do. So additional topics, a lot of you on this call today are members of the Tennessee Association of Floodplain Managers. If you're not a member of the organization, we try to bring that up and encourage you to become a member. If you pay a $25 fee, that'll pay for regional training, so it's kind of a 2-for-1. And it is important to just get information about what's going on for floodplain management, get the newsletter, and then being able to attend the conference and work with other floodplain administrators and just get more technical guidance and assistance and information at the conference and the regional trainings is really key. We do provide technical bulletins to the community. FEMA just recently came out with the TV1 for foundation openings, and then I believe they came out with TV5 for floodproofing measures. So sometimes we bring those technical bulletins to communities. We talk about the substantial damage desk reference. There's information in that technical bulletin. We bring the Tennessee Quick Guide for floodplain administrators that are brand new to floodplain management. So normally I always come bringing gifts. Sometimes I bring cookies or something to eat. Sometimes I bring a lot of paperwork. So you never leave empty-handed. You always get a lot of information and resources from myself and from Tammy, which is fun. And then we can email you a sample floodplain development permit that's in a Word document that you can go into the header and put your community's logo. So it's more tailored to your other forms that you have in your local community. And again, you can go on the FEMA Map Service Center, the msc.fema.gov, to download letter of map changes. You can also download your flood insurance study. A lot of times when we're asking if you have copies of your paper flood insurance rate maps, we ask for the flood insurance study, and y'all look at me like I'm an alien. But it's actually an 8.5 by 11 booklet that has a picture of a family being rescued on a boat that has your flood insurance study profiles for the 10, 50, 100, and 500 year flood events for various streams. And it also has information in there of the flood depth tables and different things. So you want to make sure that you have that. It does have historical information on a community's flood risk. It's a really good resource document if you're preparing a hazard mitigation plan and you need information about local flooding. It has great information in there. And then we also give communities what's called a community rating system, What If. The community rating system is a program where communities are really doing a great job with floodplain management and really have a good system together. If they have higher regulatory standards and activities, they can have credited activities where if they get 500 points, they can get 5% off their flood insurance policies. So you can get a reduction in the flood insurance rate for your citizens if you do various activities. The city of Knoxville is at a class 6. We have others that are class 8 and a class 9. So that's something that we talk about if a community is doing floodplain management really well, they want to take it to the next level. We talk about that in the meeting. We also look at the number of policies and how much of a rebate you would get if you participate in the program. If you are a community rating system, you have to have a CRS coordinator. So you have to have a point person that'll get all the documentation together every year and submit it in October to the ISO specialist for Tennessee, documenting all the activities. The big stick for this is to have 90% or better for elevation certificates. So you have to make sure that they're completed correctly, accurately, because the ISO specialist will take a sample of the elevation certificates you have for community to see if they're done correctly. If they're not, you have so many, I think you have 30 to 60 days to get them corrected, and then if not, a community can be suspended from the CRS. But it is a good program because you can get a discount and you can be more progressive when it comes to comprehensive planning and floodplain management. It's really a wonderful tool. And then there's also training. There's a lot of state sponsored, and then there's also classes you can take at the FEMA Emergency Management Institute in Maryland. So they are starting to offer the L273 course. We had a individual from Indiana last year that participated in the L273 class here in Tennessee. And he's actually going to go to Emmitsburg, Maryland in April and take the L273 in person. So that is an additional resource, or if you want to take higher level floodplain management courses, there it's online where you can register for that. They also have independent study courses. So it is a wealth of knowledge if you're looking to do some floodplain management study on your own. That's a great resource to do. So the NFIP forms, we have had the Biggert Waters 2012 Flood Insurance Reform Act that was supposed to do away with grandfathering, and then the state of Florida got really fussy about it because they had the greatest number of flood insurance policies. So there was a Homeowners Flood Insurance Affordability Act of 2014 that reinstated grandfathering, and then the flood insurance premium rate increases were capped from 15 to 18% a year. There were surcharges, $25 for individual policy for residential, and then a $250 surcharge for non-residential. They are thinking about having a risk rating 2.0 coming out in October of 2022, but the details of that are still coming out. And then also President Biden reinstated Executive Order 13690, where if you're seeking federal funds, whether it's a critical or non-critical facility, you have to elevate it 2 feet above the 500-year, or if for non-critical, or 3 feet for a critical facility. So those are some of the things there. Common non-compliance issues. I think this is really a key term, is a lack of training or misunderstanding of the minimum FEMA compliance regulations. So there's the old adage of fake it till you make it. But really, as a floodplain administrator, you can't really fake it till you make it, because if you have a community assistance visit, we're going to see that there's a lack of misunderstanding of the minimum requirements, and we will sit while we are visiting you, or visiting with the mayor, or visiting with the staff to talk about some of the issues and some of the deficiencies, and try to correct some of that misunderstanding, and then recommend training so that you understand as a community that when you participate in the program, there are certain standards that are supposed to be met. And so if you're not meeting them, when we do a community assistance visit, we're going to talk to you about what needs to be done. And so one thing we started doing is we write a CAV follow-up letter. So we're kind of doing the 1, 2, 3. So some communities have had their first letter, some have had their second letter, and there can be a third letter to address different deficiencies. If a community just ignores a letter altogether and doesn't work on any of the deficiencies or violations, they can be put on probation, which we don't want to see. We really want to try to work with communities to address these issues. And if they decide not to participate, they can be put on probation. And so the CAV would be turned over. If it was done by the state, the CAV is turned over to FEMA, or FEMA is doing the CAV. We give you so many opportunities to try to address the deficiencies or violations. And then FEMA can start the process of probation, which would give a community 1 year to correct the violation. And the decision to suspend is made at the 6-month mark. So again, if a community isn't doing anything that they're supposed to be doing, it can possibly be suspended. So probation, when a community is not doing what they're supposed to be doing, one of the things that you see is increased risk of flooding in the community, because structures are not necessarily elevated as they should be. If there's floodway encroachments that haven't had a proper engineering analysis, it can increase flooding in a community. And then there can be potential for legal action against a municipality by flooded property owners. We do have a case right now where a community built a bridge across a stream. There's no engineering analysis, no permitting, no nothing. And so the property owner is facing flooding every time it rains, and they've gotten mold in their house. So they're doing a lawsuit where they're suing the mayor, they're suing the former floodplain administrator, and all the county commissioners. So they had tried to work with the community to get some help to get a hazard mitigation grant to buy out their property. The community was unwilling. And so now their attorney is going to be doing a class action lawsuit, contacted some other folks that are in the floodplain. So I tell you all this just to let you know that if you don't do what you're supposed to be doing, there could come a day where someone files a lawsuit and there's going to be a whole lot of problems. So you want to make sure that you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. If you're not sure how to start your program, and if you're on this call today and you're not sure what to do, you can always call and schedule a meeting. We can sit down and just kind of talk about what a local community should be doing if you have questions. And then there can also be a $50 surcharge on all flood insurance policies if a community is put on probation. So if that happens, you know the mayor's phone is going to ring off the hook, and the floodplain administrator's phone is going to ring off the hook. So again, you want to make sure that you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, so that you don't have it go to this level. Because again, we want to work with you. And it's like I tell people, if you don't tell me what's going on, I can't help you. So you're never in this alone as a floodplain administrator or a participating community, but you've got to be honest and forthright and let us know if there's a potential violation or if there's a problem that's going on in your community, how FEMA and the state can help you. Suspension. So if a community does not do what they're supposed to do, they can be potentially, if they've been put on probation for a year and after the 6-month mark, nothing is occurring, they can be suspended from the program. So one of the biggest detriments is not being able to have flood insurance available from the National Flood Insurance Program. So if someone is coming into your community and you're suspended from the program, if they want to try to get a mortgage and the property is in a special flood hazard area, they're not going to be able to get a flood insurance policy. It's not going to be issued. So some private insurers also limit and prohibit flood insurance availability in suspended communities. Federally backed loans require a flood insurance policy, or they can be called due or not issued. You get very limited federal disaster assistance in the special flood hazard area. Other federal agency loans and grants may not be available. So sometimes the community, when they're applying for hazard mitigation grant on their application, it says, is the community in good standing with the NFIP? So if you're suspended and you're trying to apply for a grant, that can hurt your application process. And then the governing body may be held liable. So denies the ability for property owners to purchase flood insurance. And then not taking any kind of positive steps to reduce flood risk, given the knowledge of the flood hazard. So again, it's not a place that anybody wants to be. So if you're having issues, or if you're just struggling, just reach out and talk to myself, talk to FEMA. We're more than willing to help you guys, but we just have to know. Because with 400 communities and one staff person to help y'all, some of it I know and some of it I don't. And a lot of times I just hear from citizens that are angry. So yesterday I had 3 angry phone calls from around the state. So with COVID going on and people are still at home, my phone has probably rang more this last year than normal because people see things that are going on. So you want to make sure that when a citizen does call and have an issue, that you're respectful, that you listen to them, and that you go out and check out what's being done at a site to make sure if something is going on, the issue stop work order and make them come into compliance. Now, you also have within your ordinance that if someone is doing something that they're not supposed to be doing, that there is a violation section where the community can take litigation against an applicant, issue a stop work order. So you do have the tools, because a lot of times I think communities say, oh, we'll call Amy, she's a floodplain cop. I am not the floodplain cop. I'm just supposed to give general technical assistance, but I'm really supposed to be working with the local communities and not necessarily all the citizens calling. They should be starting with the local communities first and not leapfrogging to me. So some of you guys do that as a standard practice, and that's not good because, again, the buck stops with you. Floodplain management is a local responsibility. It's not for the state to do all the permitting and all the questions for everybody. We're supposed to be working together as a team. So again, when you have questions and stuff, make sure that you're talking to me and working with me, because if I answer the question for you and you're out of the loop, you're never going to learn it. So again, if you have questions or concerns, make sure you call or email. So do you guys have any questions?
Amy, this is Tammy. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. I keep getting this button that tells me that I may not be coming through. So I wanted to just kind of throw in 3 little comments real quick about some of the stuff we've talked about so far. And so one of the things that Amy's mentioned about the permit records, I just want to restate that those records are so important that the actual requirement is that they be kept permanently. They cannot be destroyed. And so, or they're not supposed to be destroyed, let me say that. But we've heard of, you know, a staff member being terminated or something happening and they get a little upset and they go shred files. These files related to the permits for all the development that goes in the special flood hazard area are the community's files. And I will tell you this, I have gone back and looked and requested permit records all the way back into the 70s in the last year, when things have come up and potential violations have been identified. And having those records available has been so helpful in the cases where we can find them. Now there have been cases where people have lost things through, you know, tornadoes or flooding in a building or such, but that's one thing that gets lost a lot of times, is that people fail to remember that these records are permanent. No matter what a state record retention policy may say, ours is going to supersede at the federal level, that these records have to be maintained. And I know Amy was talking about things to have readily available as you're doing a CAV, and one of the things she talked about was the ordinance. I will tell you that I make it a practice that I actually ask for a copy of the ordinance before the CAV, because I like reviewing it and having my comments, if there's going to be issues, to talk about them actually at the meeting as opposed to afterwards. So just know that there might be slight differences in what the state and FEMA may be asking related to the CAV. It's always going to be the same information. It's just that when we request it may be slightly different. And then, you know, she was talking about the importance of the elevation certificates. I can say in all the CAVs that I've done over the last 11 years, I can't recall a single CAV that I did not have elevation certificates that needed some type of correction. So it is really common that we have. I've had somebody tell me it's a sealed document from a professional. I can't question it. And then when I walked her through the document and it wasn't even her community's name on the document, she realized quite quickly that, yeah, you do need to look at these and make sure it's the right information. But thanks.
Tammy, do you want to kind of give a little bit of an announcement that you did the other day for TNA FTM board, since we have quite a few on the call today?
Yeah, so I've been working with the state of Tennessee for the last 3 or 4 years, and we've had some staffing changes in our office, and as such, I'm being reassigned to work with the state of Florida. And I'm going to be backfilled by Patricia Smithline. She goes by Trish, who's also on the call today. And so Trisha's got a wealth of experience working post-disasters for FEMA in floodplain management, particularly tied to a lot of the substantial damage. And so as of right now, we're both still supporting Tennessee, but you know, fairly soon we're expecting a date where we'll do the official transition over, where Trish will be your point of contact in the state. But you know that she's got, like I said, a wealth of information and background in both floodplain management and substantial damage, and I think she's really looking forward to supporting the state. And I know that they have, she and Amy have talked about doing some additional training specific to substantial damage.
Trish, you want to say hi to everybody?
Hi. Hi, everybody. This is Tricia Smithline. Like Tammy said, you'll see my name is Patricia on correspondence, but it's Trish unless you're mad at me. And I look forward to working with all of you in and filling some big expectations after Tammy leaves us. But for the moment, we're both with you, and thank you for having me here.
Wonderful. So unless Amy or Tim has anything else that they'd like to throw in there on CAVs, also right now we're wrapping up a little bit. So if you have any questions, anything that you want to get through, please go ahead and type it in the chat box. But before we leave, I also want to remind everyone we are going to try to get this meeting up on TNAFPM's YouTube channel. Again, that's for the Tennessee Association of Floodplain Managers. But if you Google TN space AFPM YouTube, you should be able to find it, no problem. I would also like to remind everybody that this is just one in a series of monthly webinars put on by the State of Tennessee NFIP office. So we will be having another webinar in about 3 weeks in April. You guys should see an invitation coming through from me later today. So keep an eye out for that. And again, anybody here who is an aspiring certified floodplain manager working towards that CFM credential, everyone here today is eligible, so long as you attended the full seminar, to get a continuing education credit that will work towards that. So if that is something that is particularly important to you, before we close, I'm going to have you go ahead and just type in your first and last name in the chat box. And again, if you did not receive your invitation to this webinar directly from me, that means I probably do not have your email address. So if you include your first and last name in the chat box, also, include your email address. Everyone else, if you got an invitation directly from me, make sure you should be good. I should have your email address as long as I have your first and last name. Alrighty, so I do not see any additional questions. So I hope, Amy has a comment real quick.
All right, so for y'all that are on, the call today, next month we're going to be talking about elevation certificates, how to complete them. And so I think we're going to have Mark Crowdy on there with me. So I think it'll be very fun. We just recently taught at the Tennessee Association Professional Surveyors Conference. We did a 4-hour training, and we always have a good time with that. So I think we're going to have him on with me next month. So if you have surveyors in your community that maybe need some training or just want to listen, please invite them. We would like to have them more the merrier, because this is just a great way to get a lot of attendees on the call. So we appreciate everybody being here today. If you have any questions, or you just want to email me separately about an issue or a concern that you have, please feel free to do so. Thank you.
Amy, I had one other thing that I forgot to mention, just to add on real quick. So when you talked about training at EMI, one of the benefits, if you're looking to take like the advanced concepts courses that are offered there, is FEMA will pay so the lodging is free, and FEMA will reimburse the community for the cost of the transportation up to the facility, as long as you buy the ticket that meets the proper guidelines that they give you the information on. And so about the only expense the community has is for the meal ticket and possibly meals during travel. But it is one of the most cost-effective ways to get training outside of your state that there is around there. So I just wanted to add that additional information on EMI. Thanks.
Wonderful. And again, if any of you guys have any specific questions like that, feel free to reach out to either Amy or Tammy, and we can get you guys that information. So thank you everyone so much for being on the call here today. I will go ahead and generate a full list of the attendees and save a copy of the transcript. That way you guys should be getting your certificates in the next day or two. So again, thank you guys so much. We hope you have a good Wednesday or Tuesday. Yes, today's Tuesday. And everybody out there, especially in Middle and West Tennessee, be safe tomorrow, because we've got all that weather coming in. So take care, and I hope you guys have a great day.